Welcome, everyone. Welcome. Today's class is This Year We Are Slaves, Next Year We Will Be Free with Rabbi Zachary Truboff. This is the last class out of 6 classes. And with that, I'll turn this to you, Rabbi Truboff.
Thank you, Evie. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I apologize for the delay. There was a little mess up on my end because of the clock change here in America that has not yet happened here in Israel. This is the last of our classes together. This year we are slaves. Next year we will be free, which of course is a quote from the Haggadah. Hashta abde l'shana ba b'nei chorin. This year we are slaves. Next year we'll be free. And it's a little strange. Again, we're finishing up the class. It's like Erev Purim, just a couple of days before Purim. And Pesach is still a month away, or a little bit over a month away. So there does seem to feel a little bit of a misalignment between the themes of what we've been learning and the Chagim. But I want to actually try to bridge the two a little bit tonight in the time that we have. Over the course of the last 5 sessions, we've been looking at the dynamics of slavery in Egypt and what is the process the Jewish people have to go through to become free, to become liberated, to become emancipated, with full recognition that that process is not just a physical liberation, but as much a psychic liberation, right? The slaughtering of the lambs in Egypt is in many ways the Jews' attempt to free themselves from their psychic chains within the idolatrous culture of Egypt. And as hard as it may be to leave slavery, as we've also seen, what might be even harder is not going back again, right? The temptation to return to it is seemingly ever present for the Jewish people, and everything's get tough. What do they want? They want to go back to Egypt. And we looked at last week about the dangers and the challenges of not just wanting to go back to Egypt, but making the promised land itself a new Egypt, and the Jewish king or the Jewish kingship itself a new pharaoh. What we're going to look at today is sort of like maybe the most basic question of all of this is how do we maintain our freedom, right? What does it mean to be free in a world in which the Jews and really all of humanity as a whole are yet to be redeemed? And that's the topic I want to look at. And maybe I'll dive into it just by starting with the Gemara. I apologize, I don't have the slides ready today just because of the time mix-up, but I think the source sheets were sent out ahead
It
of
is in
time.
the chat also.
Okay, good. So to sort of bring us to where we're going to be looking at today, I want to highlight there's a famous section of the Gemara of the Talmud, Masechet Megillah, Daf Yud Daled Amud Aleph, 14a. And there's a discussion there about how Purim should be celebrated. So we know in some ways Purim mirrors the other holidays, right? There's extra Torah readings, there's extra prayers, right? There's certain mitzvot that we're doing, like Yimashtalach Manot, Matanot Avyanim, right? Gifts to the poor, gifts to our friends. The Megillah itself, we know we read Megillot on other holidays. So it's a very Jewish holiday, obviously, even as it's very un-Jewish in certain ways as well. But there does seem to be one thing potentially missing from the Purim celebration, which is that on every other holiday we say Hallel, right? Every other holiday, Hanukkah, Rosh Chodesh, the Shalosh Regalim, we say Hallel. And the exceptions here would be Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, but we recognize Purim would seemingly go with those holidays where we do say Hallel. And this is a question that the Gemara looks to address. And in addressing what's really a question of liturgy, right, of the prayer book, it actually touches upon a deep philosophical question about what does it mean to be free ultimately. So I'll read. It says here, Amar Rav Yechiya bar Avin, Amar Rav Yeshua ben Korcha, Uma me'avdut lecherut aminan shira, v'mit l'chaim lo kol shekain. Right? If we look at the paradigmatic experience when a Jew should say Hallel, it's the exodus from Egypt, right? We see it when the Jews don't just leave Egypt, but after the Egyptians are conquered at the Red Sea, destroyed at the Red Sea, the Jewish people rise up and sing Shirat Hayam, right? The Song of the Sea, a joyous celebration. And our Seder nights, right? We sing Hallel as part of the Seder, in some ways commemorating the miracle of the Exodus itself. So the problem the Gemara is addressing, though, is if we say Hallel when we left Egypt, right, which is only about us being redeemed from slavery, then shouldn't we say Hallel on Purim when not only were we essentially redeemed from slavery, we experienced something better, greater, right? We were saved entirely, right? We were saved from destruction. saved from our death, right? So if you're going to do it for freedom, you should do it for life, right? Like that's certainly the assumption here. Ihachi Hillel Nami Neva. That's the Gemara says we should say Hallel on Purim. The fish ein omrim Hallel on Nesha b'chutz la'aretz, right? The Gemara's first challenge to this is that the reason we don't say Hallel on Purim is Purim is a miracle that happens in Persia, right? In Iraq, Babylonia, right? It did not happen in the land of Israel. And we don't say Hallel on a miracle that happens outside the land of Israel. That's the Gemara's first assumption. But there's a problem with that. What's the problem? Is that, again, on Pesach, we're saying a miracle for having left Egypt. Guess what? That's a miracle that took place outside the land of Israel. So again, if we say Hallel on Pesach, we should say Hallel on Purim. The Gemara continues. Again, always has a response. Until the Jewish people entered the land of Israel for the very first time, Hallel could be said on a miracle that took place anywhere. So Jews hadn't been to Israel yet, therefore they could say Hallel on the miracle of leaving Egypt. But once they've been to Israel, they can't say Hallel on a miracle in Persia. And that's what the Gemara goes on to say. Once the Jewish people entered the land of Israel, they could not say Hallel on a miracle that happened anywhere else. Reb Nachman then gives a note, which means we still have a problem. Or the problem is that we don't say Hallel on Purim because, again, it was a miracle that happened in Chutz La'aretz after the Jews had already been in Israel. That's the first answer. The second answer, Reb Nachman Amar, Kriyatah zo hilula, that the reading of the Megillah itself is a form of Hallel, presumably because the story tells about the miracle, tells about salvation, tells about the heroes, right? It gets at the themes of what Hallel is all about. Of course, it does the one thing that Hallel, or it doesn't do the one thing Hallel is supposed to do, which is praise God, right? God's name isn't mentioned in the Megillah. And then we get our third answer. Rabbi Amar, Bishlema Hatam, Hallelu Avdei Hashem, Velo Avdei Paro. Elahacha, Hallelu Avdei Hashem, Velo Avdei Achashverosh, Akati Avdei Achashverosh Anan. So what the final answer that Rabbi gives here that we're going to focus on is it makes sense that they said Hallel when they left Egypt because they were being liberated from slavery. And once the Exodus was over, the Jews were no longer slaves to Pharaoh. They were free. But here, when it comes to the story of Purim, the reason we can't say Hallel is even though the Jews are saved, like their lives are saved, by the end of the story, what we recognize is that the Jews are still slaves to Achashverosh. They're still subjugated to Achashverosh. And what's powerful is at the end of the Gemara here, Rabbi's final statement, he says, Akati Avdei Achashverosh Anan. It's not just true that the Jews in the time of the Purim story were still slaves to Achashverosh, that we Jews in his time, hundreds of years later, are also still slaves to Achashverosh. With the implication also being that even us Jews today are in a sense still slaves to Achashverosh, because until the Messiah comes, until there's redemption, right, the Jews live in the experience of subjugation, right? We are not masters of our own destiny, no matter how much we may want to be. That's one of the challenges of Zionism, is that it promises, again, power, sovereignty, freedom. But the truth is, anybody who's been watching the news the last 2 years knows all too well, right, is that Israel can't do anything, right, without the permission of more powerful nations. Right. And then until, again, the Mashiach comes, until God's providence is fully revealed, we're not free in the way that we may want to think ourselves to be free. And certainly if you live in other states where you're not the majority, you're not the dominant political or ethnic group, then certainly we all understand, right? There's the risk that things could be stable right now, but that can certainly change. And that's the experience of being a slave, right? You're not master of your own destiny. You're always subjugated. You're always in a position of fundamental vulnerability. So this Gemara represents a challenge to us if we're trying to think about freedom. We're trying to think about how the Exodus brings us to a state of freedom, because essentially what it implies is that after the destruction of the temple, after the exile, even till today, Jews are to a certain extent not quite free, because there's always somebody over us who has power over us, who's, not us, not Jewish in a sense. Now, this point, I think, is a very important point about the recognition that we're all still sort of slaves. That's why we start the Seder by saying that. It's because we are slaves still, right? We haven't experienced this transformation of total freedom. But at the same time, what it also gets at is sometimes a misrecognition about what we think freedom is. If we think freedom is only about having nobody to tell you what to do, right? The sort of anarchist notion of freedom. You can't tell me what to do. I make my own rules. Who are you? Like, I get to do what I want, right? That sense of freedom is a bit problematic for us. It's doubly problematic, not just because Jews today are still sort of subjugated, but when we look at the Torah, what we see repeatedly is that how does God describe the Jewish people, right? We're his avadim, right? Eved Hashem, we're his servants, are literally slaves. So how is it that Exodus, leaving Egypt, is supposed to make us free when we're ultimately slaves to God and maybe even still slaves to the non-Jews, right? So that again seems to present a real serious problem for us. So what I want to do is I want to look through how we might think about this. How is it exactly that we are still free, or we still have the possibility of freedom, even when we're subjugated by non-Jews, even when we're still slaves to God? And to get at that, something we have to recognize is that whatever our relationship to God is, whatever the nature of the covenant is, there is a sense in which it binds us, it obligates us, it even subjugates us, but that it also creates the possibility of our freedom. Right? There's something paradoxical that we're going to look at when it comes to freedom, that on some level, as I titled this year, the law will set you free. Right? We need the law, we need that obligation from the outside, in some sense, to actually liberate us from the world around us. And this is an idea that starts to emerge in Jewish sources, I think, in a very important and, for me, compelling way, right? That to be in a relationship with God, to feel commanded by God, by the Torah, is not actually to be a slave. It may actually be a fundamental condition for freedom. Now, as I mentioned, God describes the Jewish people as God's slaves. Just to sort of capture some of this, Rav Samson Raphael Hirsch in source 5, he specifically says to be Avdei Hashem, to be a servant of God, it means that you are sort of subjugated to God, but you are not subjugated to anybody else. Once you're God's slave, you can't be anybody else's slave. And this is, again, sort of an important point, that whatever our relationship to God may be, it somehow does free us from everything else around us. And we have to sort of unpack what that might be. To get at that, we're going to look at a famous, fairly well-known rabbinic midrash based on the verses here in source 6 from Shemot. Parshat Mishpatim, the parsha following the revelation of the Torah at Har Sinai. Mishpatim is all about the laws. And part of the laws that we get there are the laws of a Jewish servant, a Jewish slave. And as you probably know, the laws of a Jewish servant or slave, part of what makes them unique is that Jewish slavery is not meant to be permanent. It's meant to be temporary. It's supposed to only be for a period of time, right? It's closer to indentured servitude than it is to chattel slavery, like what existed in America. However, the Torah does outline that there's an exception, that the Jewish slave or indentured servants, whatever you want to call it, even though they're only supposed to be a slave for a certain period of time, they can potentially stay longer if they so choose. The Torah gives that option. So here's how it's described here, source 6. This is Shemot Parakaf Aleph. Right here are the laws that God places before the Jewish people, and we immediately get into the laws of the Jewish slave. Right, the Jewish slave is going to work for you for 6 years if you acquire one, but in the 7th they're going to go free. Whatever he sort of comes in with, he's gonna leave with. If he came in married, he's gonna leave married. Right, if he is given a wife or like a maidservant by his master once he's a slave, that maidservant stays with the master. However, the slave doesn't have to leave and leave behind again the wife that he received, if he received a wife while he was a slave, or children that he had. He can stay with the master, stay with his new wife, his new children. But there's a step that he has to go through, a particular ritual. The Gisho Adonav El Elohim, that the master will take the slave to the judges, will say. The Gisho Eladelet, they present him at the threshold, at the doorway. O El Mezuzah, basically where the mezuzah would be on the doorpost. V'ratzah et ozno. And the master pierces the slave's ear, right, as the slave is standing by the doorpost. b'matzeh ba'avado le'olam, right? And the slave will then stay with the master for forever. So again, Jewish slave is supposed to be temporary, in a sense, echoing back to Egypt, right? You can maybe be in a subjugated position, but it can't be permanent, because to be in a relationship with God means on some level being free. However, there's this one exception that a Jewish slave can stay, especially if they want to stay with their new wife and children. They can be a slave ongoing. Now, what the rabbis pick up on is sort of the symbolism of the ritual. What is the earring? What is this? The doorpost, right? The ear and the doorpost. What is going on here? And they see something very powerful in this that starts to maybe point us to why is it that we need the law, that we need mitzvot in order to be free. This is from the Gemara Masechet Kedushin, source 7. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai used to expound this verse as if it were a precious stone, the verse that we were just reading about the slave having his ear pierced at the doorway to stay with his master. Why was the ear singled out from all the other limbs of the body? Right? Why is that the symbol of the slave going forward? The Holy and Blessed One said, this ear, the slave's ear, which heard my God's voice at Har Sinai, when I proclaimed, for unto me the children of Israel are servants, and not servants of servants. And yet this man went and acquired a master for himself. Let his ear be pierced. Right? The reason the ear of the slave is pierced is there's a certain irony that's being highlighted here, which is the Jew who became a slave, the Jew heard at Har Sinai, or learned in the Torah from Har Sinai, that we are supposed to be servants of God. We're not supposed to be servants or slaves to anyone else. He heard that. He heard God's commanding voice at Har Sinai. Anochi Hashem Elokecha asher ziticha me'eretz Mitzrayim mibeit avadim. Right? I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, right? To be God's treasured nation. Right? Not to be slaves anymore, just to be in this exclusive relationship with God. And you, Jew, chose to be a slave. You should have heard God's call. You should have heard God's command. You should have been different. You should not have let that happen. But if you're going to choose it, we're going to make sure you don't forget what it's all about. And Rabbi Shimon Bar Rebbe used to also expound from this same verse, if it was a precious stone, right? Yochanan ben Zakkai talked about the ear. Rabbi Shimon is going to talk about the mezuzah, the doorpost. What's the significance of that? Why are the door and the doorpost singled out from all the other items in the home? Why is this the place we do this ritual? The Holy and Blessed One said, the door and the doorpost, which were witnesses in Egypt, when I passed over the lintel and the two posts, and I proclaimed, for unto me the children of Israel are servants, and not servants of servants. And I took them out from slavery to freedom. And yet this man went and acquired a master for himself. Let him be pierced in their presence. Right? Why is the slave's ear being pierced at the doorway? Because the doorway signifies the very first mitzvot the Jewish people truly fulfilled, as we spoke about before. The doorway is, what did they put on the doorway? The blood of the Korban Pesach, right? It was the act of sacrificing the lamb, the Egyptian gods, making that radical leap, that radical act of liberation. And they had to put it on the doorpost so the Egyptians would see it. The Egyptians would see it and know the Jews were slaughtering their gods. The Jews were risking their lives by doing this, right? This act of the ear piercing by the doorway is to remind the Jew ultimately, not only that they heard God's commanding call to be free, but that they acted radically to God's mitzvah, to fulfill God's mitzvah in order to be free. And this Jewish slave is essentially giving that, both up. And this really is where we start to realize and start being pointed in the direction of where we need to go to understand what does it mean to maintain our freedom, because it's going to have to do with hearing God's commanding voice and trying to engage in those radical acts of mitzvot that God commands us, radical acts of mitzvot that are essentially ultimately about our freedom, right? I'm sort of giving some of this away, but I'll say it more straightforwardly. The way mitzvot can feel like a burden, right? Halacha can feel like a burden. Law can feel like a burden. But there are moments in which we experience God's call in such a way that it is as if we are liberated from everything else around us, right? Mitzvot, God's call, ultimately puts us in opposition to the world. It alienates us from the world, right? Everybody else in the world is going to operate according to whatever self-interest they have, whatever communal values or ideas or ideologies they have. But as all human beings can get trapped up into that. Right? You can think about it just in terms of modern culture, modern politics, how people get sucked up into political ideologies and they literally become slaves to them, right? They can't think in any other way. God's commanding call right? The voice of God is like a knife that like cuts through all of that. Because whatever the president says, whatever MSNBC says, whatever the New York Times says, right, it all falls away, right, when God commands, when you feel that command. And again, most of the time, even if we try to follow halacha, we don't feel or hear the God's commanding voice. But it's in those rare moments that we do that we find the possibility of our freedom, because it's in those moments we find the possibility of realizing that we don't need to act the way everybody else around us is acting. Right? To hear God's call is in some ways, like I said, experience a rupture, to realize we have to be something fundamentally different in the world. And that is ultimately the ground of our freedom. Right? To hear God's call and to realize it makes a demand of us to act differently from anything else around us. That is the possibility of our freedom. Maybe to be more precise in the context of this year, the freedom that the law gives us is a freedom from, right, the world, the culture, social media, everything around us, because it cuts through all that and says none of that matters, right? It's what God says that matters, and that's where I have to be devoted in that particular moment. So this idea gets developed, I think, quite nicely by Moshe Amiel, religious Zionist, rabbi, thinker, very important one for me personally, in an essay that he writes titled Mibeit Avadim, From the House of Bondage. And what he notes, and again, as a Zionist, he's a bit radical for this, because he was saying, like I said before, that ultimately, just because we have a state, or you think you're going to have a state, you have some kind of autonomy, that doesn't necessarily make you free. That the condition of subjugation, of galut, right, continues even when you're a Jew living in the land of Israel, right? That you are never totally masters of your own destiny. That in a certain sense, servitude persists. And he says here, this is source 8 on the source sheet. V'im ki gam hashta avdei, rak avdei achashverosh v'lo avdei paro anan. Right? Servitude somehow persists, even in the time of Purim and afterwards. But what Rabbi Amiel wants to argue is, yes, the Gemara was correct to say we're still subjugated, but we are not subjugated like the Jews were in Egypt, right? Even the subjugation that we experience today is of a fundamentally different quality, not because the Goyim, not because the non-Jews are nicer, or because we don't experience outright slavery like the Jews in Egypt did, right? That's not his point. What he's saying is something changes after Yetziat Mitzrayim, after Har Sinai. We're no longer the same in such a way that we can never fully become enslaved, right? There's something about our enduring relationship with God that creates that possibility of freedom, no matter what the outside world tries to do to us. He says here, God, or Moshe told the Jewish people, we saw this last week, you're never going to see Egypt again. And what Amiel is saying is, whatever subjugation we might experience, even the Holocaust, God forbid, it wasn't Egypt. And the reason the Holocaust wasn't Egypt is because in the Holocaust, the Jewish people still had the Torah. They could still hear God's commanding voice in some way, possibly, right? That possibility, that potential was there, which enabled them to, again, act differently within a circumstance that, in the context of being slaves in Egypt, simply would not have been possible to them. Right? There's actually a famous tshuva of Raphaim Oshri, was a rabbi in one of the Lithuanian ghettos. I'm forgetting which one off the top of my head. He's asked, while the Jews are in the ghetto, whether or not they should still recite in the morning the bracha of Shelo Asani Avid, right? Thank you, good. Blessed are you, Lord our God, the universe who did not make me a slave, right? How can the Jews say that in the ghetto when they're living the lives of slaves, right? And again, and Rabbi Oshri basically says, because there's something about the covenant, this covenantal relationship with God, where we hear God's voice, still have God's Torah, can still on some level, maybe only minimally, but on some level strive to do mitzvot, that enables us to be free. That enables us to not let the Nazis determine the sum total of our existence, right? Even when the Nazis take everything away, right? They can't take away the Torah. They can't take away us hearing God's call, right? They can't take away that we know in this moment there's a mitzvah to be done and we're going to do it no matter what, right? That is the possibility of freedom that exists even in a time of subjugation. Rabbi Amiel continues, he says, where we have subjugation, but we don't have slavery. Where we can experience the physical external pressure, but the rest of the world can't make a claim to our true selves, to our souls. And only God can do that. Right? You can have ownership over property, but you can't have ownership over, like, again, somebody's soul. Even if there's subjugation on a halachic legal level, right, there are ways in which the ownership of property can be undone. And if a property is owned, or it's be mishabed, it's like a lien to somebody else. Somebody has some sort of ownership over it. That ownership can be lifted through the act of dedicating that property or that those objects to the temple. Right? He's making sort of a play on ideas here, but the sanctification of the object removes the ownership of it, and that's what he's saying is true with the Jewish people. God's choosing us being in a relationship with God, on some level removes the shi'abud, the subjugation that the rest of the world might try to impose on us. In that next paragraph there, we've left the house of bondage. We know this because God told us. God told us at Sinai, I have taken you out of the house of bondage. Beit Avadim, you're not there anymore. No amount of physical force can put us back in Beit Avadim, except maybe ourselves. I hate to say this, but the entire Torah, from the very beginning to its very, very end, was said to Moshe at Har Sinai. Kaviti Rechazal, Ben Masha Kol Yisrael Shamu Mipia Gura Ba'atzmam, Ben Masha Shamanu Idea Eben and Neman Moshe. Right? Yes, all the Torah was given to Moshe at Har Sinai. All of the Torah is basically given to Moshe. Moshe is the intermediary who gives it to the Jewish people. But in truth, that may be true, but at the same time, not exactly, right? Because there are parts of the Torah the Jewish people heard directly from God. And the parts of the Torah that we know the Jewish people heard directly from God was that moment at Har Sinai when God revealed God's self and said, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, right? The Aseret HaDibrot, right? That commanding voice of God, that commanding voice of God that was so overwhelming for the Jewish people that they said to Moshe, I'm sorry, this is too much for us. You hear God and you can tell us what he says, right? You can experience God's direct commanding presence absolutely overwhelms the people. But it doesn't just overwhelm the people in that moment. Right, God's commanding voice that they heard at Sinai, it persists for them, right? They may have said to Moshe, you hear the rest of the Torah and tell it to us, but they're never going to forget the moment of Har Sinai. They're never going to forget the moment where God speaks to them and they hear God's, commanding voice. And that is, again, the moment of covenant that becomes transformative for them. And that third paragraph there, Valkein Klal Yisrael Adayom Hazeh, Belishum Abdel, Hasiyot V'Netiyot Shonot, Mitsuyan ba'ahavat ha'chirut, right? It is the moment of Har Sinai in many ways of hearing God's commanding voice that installs the love of freedom that the Jews have. Rav Amiel has this idea that Jews are pretty stubborn about not wanting to be subjugated. Jews want to be free, right? There's a famous, joke my shul president many years ago once told it many times because it's a good joke. And the joke is about Richard Nixon and Golda Meir meeting up, right? They were leaders of their respective countries at the same time. Obviously, America was a very important ally, so to speak, for Israel. It carried a lot of weight, carried a lot of power. And when Golda Meir and Richard Nixon were meeting, right, Golda was sort of comparing to Nixon sort of the difference between their respective countries, the difference between their respective leadership. And Golda was sort of saying, you may think you have a big country, Richard Nixon. You may think it's so hard to be the president. But, at the end of the day, you're the president of America. You're the leader of the free world. What you say, happens, right? So at the end of the day, is it really that hard? She says, my situation is a little different. Israel may be tiny, tiny, tiny compared to America. There only be like 5 million people here. But the difference between you and me is that America only has one president. Israel has 5 million people who all think they're the prime minister alongside me, right? And that makes my job a little bit harder, right? And what that joke gets at, many things that it gets at, but part of what it gets at is Jews don't like somebody else being in charge, right? Jews have this yearning for freedom. And if we want to be authentic about it, right, Jews have a yearning for freedom because Jews perhaps know better than just about anybody else what it means to be subjugated, both because we remind ourselves of it every year at the Seder, but also because our history has often been an experience of that. So Jews love freedom. They yearn for freedom. As Rabbi says, Jews hate slavery, right? They hate the idea of being slaves. They hate the idea of force power being used to enslave others. But Tamid Anu Roim at Bnei Yisrael Shehim Arishanim Omdim B'Maracha Lilchom Et Milchemet Chayrut. Right? When it comes to the fights for freedom, you're always going to see Jews at the front of the line, anywhere it happens in the world, any nation that it takes place in. Because this yearning for freedom has already been instilled in our blood, in our souls. From the day of Mount Sinai, Zohi hitpatchut sheba'a me'ozen sheshama ar Sinai avdaihem velo avadim la'avadim. Right, the Jewish yearning for freedom, the Jewish experience of freedom, goes back to Har Sinai, to the moment when God said, "You are my servants and nobody else's." Right? It's God hearing God's commanding voice at Har Sinai, which we might think is the ultimate form of servitude. Right? That's the moment we didn't have a choice. God held the mountain over our heads. We were slaves. You might think that. What Ramil is also pointing to is that to hear God's call is to recognize that there's a fundamentally different way of being in the world, different from everything else that we are called to no matter what, right? And the greatest challenge of being free is not that you don't have anybody to tell you what to do, right? The greatest challenge of being free is that when everybody is doing one thing, you have the freedom to do something else. You have the ability, right, to move in a different direction, right? That's the hardest thing to be free, because again, most of us in our core, right, we want to do what everybody else is doing, right? We take our cues from looking at the people around us. But to hear God's call is to say, no matter what everybody else is doing, right? It's the old thing when you're a kid, right? If all your friends were going to jump off a bridge, would you too? Right? And our parents catch us doing something bad with our, friends. My parents certainly use that with me. And of course, there's a certain irony there, because the truth is we will almost always do the things that everybody else is doing, even if they're self-destructive, right? Because again, if they're doing it, we should do it. The idea of breaking away from that is almost impossible to us. Right? Conformity to what everybody else is doing is the ultimate form of slavery. And yet, what Ramil is noting is that to hear God's call is to be standing on the bridge while everybody else is jumping off, and to say, you know what, I can't do that. I'm not going to do that. And that is not an easy thing to do. If you remember when you were a kid, all your friends are doing that thing they're not supposed to do. I don't think there's a greater temptation or enslavement in life than feeling like, of course, I've got to do that. You're just like right there along with them. What Ramil is saying is to hear God's call is to find the freedom to step away from what everybody else is up to. Rav Amil emphasizes this in a couple of places. We don't have time necessarily to fully work it out right now. But one of the things he does repeatedly emphasize is that the freedom of the Jewish people in many ways stems from the fact that they can't be like everybody else, right? To be a Jew on some level means to be different, maybe not to be different all the time, right? That might be asking for too much for most of us. But if you want to be a Jew, it means the ability to be different at least once in a while, to hear God's call and to recognize something else is demanded of you. And part of the challenge with almost all of sort of modern Jewish life today is the way in which so many of the responses to modernity by the Jewish people have been expressing this desire to be like everybody else, right? Whether it's assimilation, whether it's religious inclinations that embrace modern culture, or whether it's Zionism, right? Most famously, right? I forget if I've spoken about this here or not, right? Zionism is about being like all the other nations, right? That was the whole Herzl's dream. Right? We're going to be like everybody else. There won't be any more anti-Semitism once we're no longer this strange, alien, uncanny people that nobody knows what to do with. When we have our own nation, we have our own land, we'll be just like everybody else. Right? And Ramil's whole point is to hear God's call to be in a covenant is that you're never going to be like everybody else. Right? You can't just go along with the pack, go along with the herd, do exactly what you've always done from the time you were, raised. Right? In many ways, sort of the model here of Jewish freedom is Abraham, right? Even before, Abraham is given direct commandments by God, right? Abraham, at least in the midrash, famously challenges the idolatrous culture around him, right? His father's an idol maker. Abraham knows idols are just pieces of stone and wood. He does his best to try to show this to other people and around him, to his father, right? Why do you believe these false gods? Don't you see they're nothing? to challenge the society around you in that kind of way, to point out its contradictions, to show its ethical failings, right? That's not something most of us want to do. Because when you do that, when you act free, as Abraham does, because you realize that the way things are is not necessarily the way they need to or should be, right? There tends to be one consequence that goes along with it. If you know the midrash, Abraham smashes the idols, what happens next? Right? His father takes Abraham to the king basically to be killed, right? When you truly demonstrate your freedom, which means, again, not doing what everybody else is doing, it is not just a rupture for you, it is disruptive to everything around you, right? How could the Jews not be doing what they're supposed to be doing? What's going on here, right? But in many ways, that is the true definition of freedom, which is something that Rabbi Miel understands, right? To be a Jew, as I said, means to not do what everybody else is doing, at least some of the time, right? To hear those moments of God's call and to know we are commanded to something else. And in the act of answering that command, right, we are free because we are no longer bound, constrained, determined by the world around us and what the world tells us to do. This idea becomes really clear, expressed almost. I was surprised when I saw this because it just becomes so powerfully embodied in a famous Mishnaic teaching in Pirkei Avot. This is source 10 on the sheet. It really gets at everything that we're talking about here, that the condition of freedom is the ability to hear God's call and be able to answer it. This is source 10, Pirkei Avot, Perek Vav, Mishnah Bet, chapter 6, Mishnah 2. Amar Yeshua ben Levi, b'chol yom bayom bat kol yotzeit mehar chorev. Every single day, a heavenly voice departs from Har Chorev. Umachrezet be'omeret. And what does the heavenly voice say from Har Chorev, from Sinai? Chorev is a rabbinic name for Sinai, or a biblical one as well. Ve'omeret, what does the voice say? Oy lehem lebriot me'elbona shel Torah. Woe to human beings who basically don't take the Torah seriously. Shekol mi she'enos osek b'Torah nikran mizuf. Because everybody who doesn't engage with Torah is in some ways distant, we'll say, from God. Shenemar nezem zahav ba'av chazir, isha yafa, b'sar tatam. Ba'omer, and it says here, again, famously about the luchot, the 10 commandments, va'luchot maseh Elohim hema, right, the luchot, the first set of tablets, were literally crafted by God's hands, or literally come from God. Va'michtav, michtav Elohim. Right, not just the tablets themselves, but the writing on the tablets also comes from God, and it's charut al luchot. Right, the writing of the 10 Commandments is engraved on the tablets, and the Mishnah goes on to say al tikra charut ela cherut. Right, don't say that the 10 Commandments are engraved on the tablets. Rather, it is the engraving of the 10 Commandments that represents freedom. Right? Charut, engraving, really should be read as cherut, freedom. Right? And you can see here the connection between law, commandment, and freedom. And he continues, the only person that is truly free is one who is able to engage on some level with Torah. And it's interesting in the language osek, not just lomed, but osek, we'll come back to that, to busy oneself, to engage with, more than just learning. There's like an action level applies to it as well. The final point here, again, that freedom is a condition of our ability to engage the Torah. So we have to understand what all this means, right? Freedom comes from the commandments on the luchot, on the tablets, right? And freedom comes from the engagement with Torah. So we'll look at a couple of commentaries, and then we'll try to drive this home as we conclude. Rashi famously says here, this is source 11. What does it mean that to study Torah makes you free? So I want to just point out, it's kind of strange to say that studying Torah makes you free, right? Studying Torah may make you smart, might make you know more about the law, but like, come on, like, what does studying Torah have to do with making you free? So we're going to see, it's interesting, we're going to see different answers, sort of a wide range of answers even, before we get at sort of the point that I've been leaning towards. So Rashi says here, if you learn a lot of Torah, Rashi says, you'll become honored. People are going to think you're an important person. You become a rabbi, maybe even a Rosh Yeshiva or head of the seminary, right? If you study Torah, it's a pathway towards, honor and power. But if you don't study Torah, that pathway is going to be forever closed to you. Right? It's almost as if you're going to be exiled because you don't have the pathway of Torah to gain respect, dignity, power, authority, which is the true pathway to freedom. Now, again, when you read this, it's hard not to be a little cynical, right? That freedom is about power and honor and things like status, essentially. That's not usually the way we want to think about freedom. But that's what Rashi says. That's one possibility here. But I think Rashi comes to this in part because it's hard to exactly understand how is it that the Torah makes you free? As we said, Torah is all about laws. We don't typically equate laws with freedom. Tiferet Yisrael is a much later commentary on the Mishnah on Pirkei Avot. He says something a little different. How is it that Torah study makes you free? He says, "Sharak hu eno mishtabed v'gam eno mishubad lahagufaniut v'zot ha'chirut." He says the study of Torah liberates us. It makes us free because it makes us free from our physical desires. So nafsho eno mishuabedet l'tavot hagufani. Because when you study Torah, you learn how to separate from your sort of base physical needs. Instead of thinking that like money and all these other physical needs, pleasures are what are important, the Torah orients you towards more important spiritual matters. And therefore, you're freed from pursuing all of these material needs and desires. This is the true freedom, right? You're not going to wake up in the morning and try to make a lot of money, right? You're not going to become a slave to the man working a 12-hour a day job, right? What really matters, Torah study. So you're not going to have to be trapped by, again, all your material desires. And there's certainly a truth to this. We know many people, I'm sure we all do, who work really hard and make tons of money. But at the end of the day, they're a slave to their own desires, right? Like there's nothing truly free about them, right? That's why we call it the rat race, right? Like rats aren't free, right? That's the whole idea behind it, right? They're stuck sort of pursuing certain desires or needs they can't escape from, right? But the Torah somehow orients you a little differently. So you're focused on spiritual things. You're not trapped by your physical needs. So again, I think there's a truth to this, but again, freedom can't just be about not wanting material things, right? Number one, material things are necessary at times. And number two, right, it sort of makes freedom something spiritual, as if there wasn't anything more to it. The last commentary I'll look at here is from Pirkei Moshe, is another more modern commentary. And again, trying to figure out, why does studying Torah make you free? Why does this engagement with Torah make you free? And he says here, this is in the bolded part, Va'al ken amar, she'ein lecha ben chorin ela osek b'Torah. Yira ki im hiyot sheyesh ofen acher mechirut ben anashim kamo shu chirut asher lemalachim hasarim she'en adonu moshel lehem gadol mehem v'chin kol hamushpach me'amaracha beribuy hatzavot v'chitzoniyot hine in kol hatzavotahem hem yiraim le'abdam pitom le'et tamut raglam. He's saying here something very interesting, and this moves us more in the direction that I've been talking about, right? You might think, who ultimately embodies freedom? It's the king. Right? Anybody who's in a very high elevated status, somebody who's really rich, somebody who's very powerful, right? They must be truly free. Why? Because presumably they have power, and therefore nobody's going to tell them what to do. Who gets to tell the king what to do? Who gets to tell the president what to do, right? You got all this power. They must be the ones who are truly free. But what Pirkei Moshe notes here is that if your freedom is dependent on your power, it is always vulnerable. Because if your freedom is dependent on your power, then what are you going to always be worried about? You're going to be worried that the moment you lose your power, you're no longer going to be free. Your freedom is fundamentally conditional. When you tie your freedom to certain material circumstances, even to certain political circumstances, right? You're going to always be worried that the moment they are gone, that you are no longer free. And if you're always worried about losing your freedom, even if you're free right now, but if you're always worried that it could disappear any 5 minutes, then you're not really free, right? The fear of the loss of freedom is as much a slavery as anything. I think we all know this. Everybody's been watching the news the last several years, right? The moments of crisis or panic, right? Even if they don't actually come to fruition, just the fear of it can be something that enslaves you. And the Pirkei Moshe's point here is that happens to you no matter how powerful you are, right? You're always in this position of potential vulnerability because you might lose your power and you will lose your freedom in the process. But the point here is that the Jewish relationship to God and Torah is fundamentally different than that, right? Our freedom isn't dependent on our physical circumstances. Our physical circumstances don't determine who we are and what we do as a Jew. Because if there's an engagement with Torah, right, there's that possibility of hearing God's call. If you remember, what did this Mishnah say? God didn't just speak to the Jewish people at Har Sinai, thousands of years ago, right? The Mishnah says, Kol Yom Vayom, every day, a divine call goes out from Mount Sinai, right? That possibility of hearing God's commanding call exists for all of us, even today. And that possibility is through the engagement of Torah in some way. And again, the osik, the to busy oneself, to engage with Torah, I think is very important here. It's not about knowledge that one is learning and absorbing, right? It's not about a list of laws that one has to fulfill, right? The esek, the engagement, is something that we devote ourselves to. And again, it's not just the absorbing, right? It is the doing as well. To engage with Torah is not just to learn it, it is to do it, right? To be free isn't just to hear God's call, right? What's the greatest challenge of freedom is not necessarily hearing God's call. It's being ready to answer when God does call, right? That's the biggest challenge, right? What often is the hardest about freedom is when the moment comes in which we have the chance to demonstrate it, we're fearful, right? We don't want to take that step, right? Because that's freedom's radicality. To really be free means to, like I keep saying, act apart from everything else. That's a rupture. That means going in this direction when everybody else is going in that direction. That is a terribly scary thing to do. But to hear God's call preserves that possibility for us. And the last thing I'll say is there is a very interesting midrash Tanhuma, which actually gets at this idea, I think, very, very powerfully. That even when the Jews are subjugated, they're also still free. This is midrash Tanhuma on Parshat Noach. And it gets at, as I keep saying, that even when the Jews are sent into exile, when the Jewish kingship is lost, when the temple is destroyed, right, to be in exile is the condition of being subjugated, right? That goes back to the Purim story, right? Purim story begins in exile and subjugation, and it ends in exile and subjugation. Part of the reason we know this is actually a good point. I mean, this comes out of the Pirkei Moshe we just saw. At the end of the Megillah story, you've got a Jewish queen, and you've got a Jewish, vice president, essentially, right? Mordechai is like second to Ahasuerus. So you might think the story ends, the Jews are in this great position, right? Now they're never had more power. Things couldn't be better for them. Of course they're free. But what we already saw is if that freedom is dependent on political circumstances, if freedom is dependent on having a Jewish queen and having a Jewish vice president, then you're not really free, because what you have to be worried about is what happens when Esther's not around. What happens when Ahasuerus gets angry again and Mordechai is no longer second in charge, right? To be subjugated means no matter how much political power you accrue, you can always potentially lose it, which means that if your freedom is dependent on, having enough politicians who like the Jews, you always got to be worried that those politicians may not be around forever. And the Midrash's point is basically to remind us that's not what freedom is about. When you're in exile, when you are subjugated, your freedom comes from, again, our covenantal relationship with God. And the way that this Midrash gets at that is by taking us back to a story that is actually parallel in time to the Esther story, more or less. And that is the story of basically the time before the Esther story, right before it, I should say. The story of Daniel, and also the story of Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, right? These are Jews who are in Babylonia before the Persians conquer Babylonia. Their story, the story of Daniel, the story of Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, is actually similar to Esther in a lot of ways. They all rise up to positions of prominence in the Babylonian king's court, in Nebuchadnezzar's court, Belshazzar's court, kind of like Esther and Mordechai do. And what the story plays out is the Babylonian king's desire for the Jews essentially to assimilate, right? He sets up an idol, he demands that all the Jews bow down to them, right? And basically what happens is Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, who are in the king's court, these Jews, they refuse to bow down. And because they refuse to bow down to the king's idol, right, they're put in the fiery furnace, condemned to death. Except God does a miracle and saves them, right? You can almost hear the resonances here with Abraham, right? Abraham smashes the idols. He's taken to the king. If you're not familiar, the Midrash says the king, Nimrod, tries to kill Abraham by putting him in a fiery furnace. Miracle, Abraham is saved, right? That Midrash is clearly drawing on the story of Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The Midrash points out that even as the Jews in Babylonia are subjugated to the Babylonian king, to Nebuchadnezzar, the reason they're able to resist, the reason they're able to say, we're not bowing down to your idol, is because ultimately Nebuchadnezzar is not their true king, right? To be a Jew means to only have one king, right? It means to have God as our king. And therefore, at the end of the day, Nebuchadnezzar may have his laws, may have his commandments, but God's commandments will ultimately always come first. right? In Judaism, there's a general rule we call what's called dina de malchuta dina, that wherever you live, you do have to follow the rules of the state, of the king, of the authorities. But there's exceptions because there are certain things that God demands of the Jews that are non-negotiable, right? At the end of the day, it doesn't matter what the earthly king wants. We are only responsible to the call, the command of the heavenly king, right? The Ribono Shel Olam, the master of the world. And that's what this midrash plays out, is that even when we are subjugated, we are still only truly subjugated to God, which means in our subjugation to God, we are liberated from the way the rest of the world wants to impose its will on us. And what the midrash notes, actually, in an interesting way, is that when the three Jews basically respond to the king and they say, we're not going to bow down to your idol, at a certain point, they don't even call him King Nebuchadnezzar. They just call him Nebuchadnezzar. And I'll just read you, this is the highlighted part, I think they're in the last source. They did not address him as king, but simply as Nebuchadnezzar. And they said to him, we have no need to obey you in this demand. If you had issued a decree concerning taxes or levies upon our crops or upon anything else, we would say, I keep the king's command. When it comes to you, Nebuchadnezzar, we'll follow most of your laws, almost all your laws. And we would obey you because you're the earthly king. But when you command us to deny our God, then you are merely Nebuchadnezzar. You're not a king to us anymore. Because at that point, there's only one king we hear calling us. We have no need to respond to you in any demand, for we have been commanded in regarding to the oath of God. Right? That to be in a relationship with God, to be subjugated to God is ultimately the condition of being liberated from the world around us. It's what gives Jews the ability to be different, to act different, to swim against the current, right? To smash the idol, to risk everything, right? When Rabbi says Jews are at the forefront of fighting for freedom, right? That is because Jews understand what it means to be called to be different, right? To be called to be different from everything else, to be different from the way society says that the way things are supposed to be, right? And that is freedom, right? To recognize that we are only ultimately responsible to one authority in this world, and that is God's authority. And no human being, Jewish or not, can get up on Har Sinai and call out and claim they speak for God, right? God's commanding voice from Har Sinai can be heard by any Jew and any human being ultimately, right? If we have the ability to hear it. And as I said before, right, the greatest condition of freedom, the greatest difficulty of freedom, as hard as it is to hear God's call, it's even harder to be able to answer it. Because that always requires risk and a sense of radicality that often terrifies us. But that's what real freedom is. That's what it means to step into it. And that's the kind of strength and courage it takes ultimately to maintain it. But as long as we're Jews, as long as we're on some level engaging with Torah, however we imagine that, doesn't mean have to be studying Jewish texts all day long, but as long as there's somewhere in our lives an engagement with Torah, right, there's that possibility of hearing God's commanding call. And again, we're going to read the Exodus story this year. Pesach is coming, right? Hard not to see the messages in that and how that are relevant potentially to our own lives today. And the real challenge is recognizing that our freedom is not contingent on who's the president or who's the prime minister. Our freedom is ultimately contingent on whether we can hear God's call and know that whatever the president or prime minister says, that does not define who we are or how we're supposed to be in this world. I'll end with that, and I don't know if we have a minute or two for any questions or comments, but I'm happy to do it. Let me just take a look.
I can read the questions.
Sure.
There really wasn't any questions, just one comment, but.
So I see Shoshana pointed out, and it's a very good point, and I tried to address it a little bit at the end there, right? There is something anarchic about God's call to us, because no human being can claim to speak for God, right? That is the power of Torah. No Jew, and no rabbi, and no group of Jews has a monopoly on the meaning of Torah. As the Rambam famously says in the Mar Nevuchim, and the Guide for the Perplexed, that the gates of interpretation are always open. Now, we may think, oh, that's this great liberal idea, right? Nobody can speak for God. Nobody can tell us what God wants or what the way things are supposed to be. So there's something powerful about that. But at the same time, there's also something terrifying about that, because what it means is we don't really ever know exactly what God wants. And the flip side is that we might then want to resolve this problem by thinking that God never wants anything at all, right? The alternative too having individuals who claim they speak for God is assuming that nobody can speak for God. Nobody can ever even hear God. So what I'm asking for, what I think the Torah is asking for here is walking that difficult path in between, where no individual can speak for God, but at the same time, we have to be open to the possibility that God is going to call us, that a moment's going to come in a mitzvah that we maybe haven't thought about anymore is suddenly going to mean everything to us. It's suddenly going to orient us, command us in ways that we didn't really think were possible. To be open to God's call, even if we know that nobody can speak for God. But I think that is the challenge. That is what it means to be in a covenant with God ultimately. And it's the possibility of that, like I keep saying, that maintains the possibility of our freedom no matter what is going on around us. Again, I mean, not to end on a dire note, but if you read about the Holocaust, if you read about October 7th, right, even in the most difficult, impossible of circumstances, to be a Jew means the possibility of holding on to one's freedom no matter what, because what they can't take away is our connection to God, is that ability to hear God calling to us and to act other than what the world around us may want from us, or believe is even possible. And that is the challenge. That is something, at least for me in difficult times, I very much try to hold on to.
Shoshana, it looks like you're also unmuted, right?
I'm still, I hear the answer and I'm feeling it as, but what about, and I mean, from Rabbi Truboff's other hats, what about B'tei Din, the Tel Agunot, tough. Lo Natirota.
Right.
That's where I'm coming from. I'm not coming from the political side.
Yeah, no, right.
So, and what's Ezer Alami?
Ezer Alami is a collection of Rav Amiel's essays that were published.
Okay, because I just bought a whole pile of Rav Amiel books, and that wasn't on the list.
No, it's not. It's on Otzar Chachma if you have access to that.
Okay.
But there's some very good ones there. To your point about Batei Din, so that the work. I mean, again, without
I know
getting into all of it.
So.
No. So again, part of what a Beit Din is, to a certain extent, a bit of an illusionary authority, right? Because a Beit Din today, no rabbi has smicha of which they can claim that God has ordained them to be an official religious authority, right? That kind of smicha begins with Moshe and ends, a couple 100 or 200 years after the destruction of the Second Temple, which basically means that any Jew can potentially take up sort of the mantle of authority, the mantle of hearing God's call. Right. So the question becomes, we still need authority. Like, we still have to invest people with some level of power and control. But Judaism never closes the door on individuals being able to take up the mantle of Torah in a way that enables them to challenge existing structures of power. It never closes that door. It may make it very hard to find the door at times, but I can promise you it never, totally closes that door. And in many ways, I spend a lot of time in my job, often dealing with rabbis who, as I've said before, have done everything they can to close out this possibility that God may demand something of them other than what they think. And in many ways, hearing the cry of the Aguna, being there for people for whom the law has, chewed up and spit out, is often the primary way in which one can hear God's commanding voice. Because again, if God makes clear repeatedly, right, what God cares about is not the rich and the powerful and the rabbis, right? God cares about the oppressed. And to look away from them is ultimately to reject God's call in the most direct way possible. Rav Amiel, I'll end with this. Rav Amiel tells a very important story for me. It's in an essay originally that he writes on the book of Jonah. If you're familiar with the book of Jonah, what distinguishes it, especially its beginning, is that God calls to Jonah the prophet to go to Nineveh to prophesy its destruction. And Jonah does something basically no other prophet does, which is he runs the other way. God calls, and unlike Avram, unlike Moshe, unlike everybody else, instead of saying, Hineni, I'm here, let's go, right? Jonah runs the other way. And Rav Amiel says when he was young, and he would read the story, it comes up every year, we read it on Yom Kippur, he found it very troubling. Because if God's calling to you, like, how could you run the other way, right? This is God. Like, you wait for these moments, right? This is it, right? How could you turn away from it? Rav Amiel said he couldn't understand it until he became a rabbi. and it was World War I. He was a rabbi in Poland, and he was traveling by train during World War I in Poland, and he happened to be in a very crowded train car. And Poland, well, the large Jewish community between Poland and the Russian Empire, Poland was fighting the Russian Empire and Germany in World War I. Poland was not a very great place for the Jews at that time, lots of anti-Semitism. On the train, there's a lot of Polish soldiers. And the Polish soldiers are giving Rabbi a hard time because he's demonstrably Jewish, beard, hat, whatever. They see him, they start kind of like hitting him, calling him names, whatever. He happens to see another Jew in the car, and he basically like gestures to him. They kind of come together, and the other Jew tells Rav Amiel, I think there's room in the back. Like, let's go to one of the back cars, right? Like, you'll have room there. We can escape these anti-Semitic Polish soldiers. And so Rav Amiel goes to the back, and there's a car. It's basically empty. And he's like, oh, thank God. Like, I got rid of those, got away from those anti-Semites. Except he looks and he sees there's a Polish soldier in this last car. And the Polish soldier is laying down on the bench, and he's clearly been very wounded from the fighting or something like that. And Rav Amiel can tell, like, he's close to death, right? This guy's really on his last legs. And Rav Amiel kind of breathes a sigh of relief, because he's like, you know what, this, Polish soldier, they're all anti-Semites. Like, at least I can be back here. I don't have to worry about this guy. He's going to die soon anyway. So Rav Amiel sits down. He's feeling kind of good about himself, but the Polish soldier starts making noises, right? He's groaning, he's mumbling, right? He's on his last legs. And Rav Amiel looks over, looks at the guy's face, and realizes he's going to die real soon. And in seeing this, something about it just Rav Amiel can't take, and he runs out of the car. And he doesn't just run out of the car, he runs back to where all the other anti-Semitic Polish soldiers are. And he says in that moment, he finally understood why, or what it was like for Jonah to run away from God's call. Because in looking at this anti-Semitic Polish soldier dying on the bench, Rav Amiel realized he was also looking into the face of God. And in seeing that pain, which is of the soldier, which is also the pain of the Shekhinah, Rav Amiel couldn't bear it, and he ran from it. And that story has a lot of meaning for me for a lot of reasons. But to your point, again, where do we hear the cry of God, the call of God, the command of God? It comes from the Torah, but it also comes from, those who which the system has essentially, oppressed and excluded in dramatic ways. And the challenge is again, how do we be open to that possibility, right? There's something impossible for about a Jewish rabbi in the World War I to sit there and show empathy for the anti-Semitic Polish soldier. I don't have to spell out the parallel situation in our own time, but you could imagine what that might be. But that is exactly where God's command is. That is the act of freedom ultimately, because when every other Jew or every other person in that situation would say, again, you have no responsibility there. If it's horrifying, if it's too much for you, get away from it. Rav Amiel is recognizing that God's command is commanding him to do the opposite, right? And in that moment, what he's saying is, I failed to live up to the possibility of freedom. The possibility of freedom would mean me, the Jew, the rabbi, to be there with this anti-Semite as he's dying. I can't cure him, can't help him, but God's calling, and I need to at least be there with him. I need to show that much responsibility. And so that's the challenge of freedom. All right, I'm happy to end here, but thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Truboff, and thank you, everyone who joined us today. And just a reminder that we have other classes you can sign up for at drisha.org/classes. A couple of people also asked me about recordings. Please email the main office of Drisha for recordings. The classes are recorded, and this one indeed was. And with that, let's thank Rabbi Truboff again. And again, we're waiting for the next series with you. And thank you again, everyone who joined us today.
And Purim Sameach.
Purim Sameach.